Welcome to Tea and Tarot with me, your host, Yashna. Each week I'll share what I've learned as I dive deeper into the world of tarot. I've got my cards in front of me, my cup of tea, and I can't wait to share this journey with you. This is Tea and Tarot.
Welcome back to Tea and Tarot. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the different tarot decks that exist out there, including some of the oldest decks that were first used for tarot readings. And then I will be introducing my personal favorite deck that I use for my very own readings, the Light Seers deck by Chris Ann. Generally, there are a lot of tarot decks that have been published and are available to buy online. There are so many different artistic styles within the tarot decks, and there's no one best tarot deck for everyone. Like, I can't tell you this is the one tarot deck that will be best suited for you. Of course, I have my personal favorite, which is the one I practice with regularly, but all the different artwork that exists is there for a reason because different decks call out to different people. So before you buy your own deck, it's really worth taking the time to scroll through and see what options exist out there and which one you feel most connected to. There's a website that I will link in my story called www.tarot.com/tarot/decks. Pretty easy to find, but it literally lists out all of the different tarot decks. It has images and screenshots of what each of the decks looks like, so you can browse through before you buy one. A huge part of tarot is interpretation and feeling connected to your cards, so it's really important that you invest in something you feel connected to and are going to be willing to put in your time and energy. So with that little tidbit of info on choosing your own deck, I'm going to take a step back and talk about some more historical decks that have led to where we are now. I talked a bit about these during my last episode where I broke down the overall history of tarot. One of the oldest tarot decks that still exists today, and really I should be saying decks in quotation marks, quote unquote decks, because the Visconti Sforza collection refers to the incomplete sets of 15 decks from the 15th century that still exist today and are kept in lots of different museums, libraries, people who collect them more privately. There are no complete decks that survived from that time period, but there are different pieces from each of these different 15 decks that help piece together what tarot overall looked like at that time. This also dates back to when tarot was called triomphe for casual playing cards. And these cards still carried a lot of the same themes, such as the Fool, the Empress and the Emperor, Death, and different suit cards for the minor arcana that were used later on. The next most complete deck that was used was the Tarot of Marseille. This was an Italian tarot deck with 78 cards that was really popular in France in the 17th and 18th centuries. As I mentioned in my breakdown on the history of tarot, this was one of the original tarot decks that was first used for playing cards by nobility. And it served as the inspiration for many modern tarot decks today. The actual name, Tarot de Marseille, was given to the deck in 1856 by French historian Romain Merlin and Paul Marteau. Marteau? I'm sorry, I'm so bad at pronunciations. What's interesting there is it wasn't actually called that throughout the entirety of when it was used in the 17th and 18th centuries, but was later named that, and it continues to be called that today. The deck had the same format as modern tarot decks do now. There were 22 tarot cards or trump cards and 56 cards split into 4 suits. The suits at this time were slightly different, but mostly similar. It included the swords, cups, coins instead of pentacles, but those are largely representative of the same thing, and then clubs instead of wands. The 4 face cards remain the same. At the time there was the valet, which translates to knave or page, then the cavalier, which is horse rider or knight, Dame, the Queen, and then Roy, the King. So that's one of the oldest complete decks that we can really see. And it's hard to talk about every single deck that exists out there, so I'm only going to highlight a few. One other deck I want to talk about before I jump into the two that I have with me is the Thoth Tarot deck. This is also one of the earlier decks that was created and is still used in practice today. I want to talk about this one because it was so fascinating to learn about the connection to the Book of Thoth when I was breaking down the history of tarot. So I do want to share a little bit more about this deck as well. This deck was painted over 5 years, starting in 1938 and was finished in 1943. It was painted by Lady Frida Harris with instructions from Aleister Crowley, who referred to this deck as the Book of Thoth, pulling a lot from that inspiration that all of the magic and divinity that was held in the cards came from Egyptian mythology. So he really took a lot of that and imbued it into these cards. He changed a lot of the major arcana names and some of the minor ones as well. Some examples of that was, instead of strength as one of the major arcana cards, he used lust instead. Instead of temperance, there was art. The court cards were knight, queen, prince, and princess instead of king, queen, knight, and page. The minor arcana suits were also mostly the same, but did use discs instead of pentacles. As you dive deeper into other layers within the tarot decks as well, there's slightly different links between the cards and the different planets, different astrological signs as well, which I'm not going to dive into only because I don't understand that side of the tarot decks much yet. So it wouldn't make sense to compare astrological signs between decks when I don't have that basis to compare to. But it is a very popular deck that is still used today for a lot of practices and does have pretty different symbolism and characters throughout the deck. So it's really interesting to look at. And now I'm going to jump into the Rider-Waite deck, which is one of the most popular tarot decks used today and was also the first tarot deck I was ever gifted. So it is the first one I tried to practice with. I mentioned this before in my introductory episode, but it wasn't a deck I felt as connected to, so I didn't practice with it as much and ended up using the Light Seers deck instead. But it is still a deck that I have with me and is super popular, and the imagery is what's more popularly used when people refer to tarot decks and tarot themes. So the Rider deck was first published by the Rider Company in 1909 based on instruction from A.E. Waite and illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith. You'll hear the deck called several different things, but usually a combination of the names Waite, Smith, and Rider. So sometimes it's called the Waite-Smith deck, Rider-Waite-Smith deck, Rider-Waite deck, or just the Rider Tarot deck. Waite and Smith were both members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was a secret society dedicated to occult studies and practices. So that's how they met, and a lot of the imagery and the influence you see in that deck comes from the fact that they were both part of this order together. The imagery carries a lot of symbolism from older decks, but also removed and added a lot to each of the different cards, particularly changing some of the Christian themes you see in them. For example, the Lover's card had previously shown a clothed man and a clothed woman as the couple, but was changed in this deck to depict Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden instead. The minor arcana were expanded with a lot more meaning in each card, rather than carrying over the simple symbols for each of the suits. In some of the older decks, the minor arcana cards looked more similar to playing cards, where the differences between a 2 of wands and a 3 of wands was really just the number of wands on the card. But Waite wanted to add a lot more symbolism to each of those cards. In line with some of the astrological teachings from the Golden Dawn, Waite also switched the order of the major arcana around so that the different cards aligned with different zodiac signs better. This is also a reason you might see the order of the major arcana slightly different between different tarot decks based on how people order it for astrological symbolism or because they're carrying it over from the Tarot de Marseille versus what Waite did with the Rider deck in 1909. So, for example, he switched strength and justice so that strength would correspond to Leo and justice with Libra. Kind of interesting. There's a lot that is packed into this deck, and because it is one of the decks that I have and is what is used in the Ultimate Guide to Tarot book, I will be breaking down the symbolism and the imagery in each of the cards a lot more as I go through this podcast. There have been several publishings of this deck in the last century. This was originally published between 1910 and 1920 with the original imagery, and then various editions kept releasing until about 1939, and then started to release again from 1971 to 1977. The imagery that I have in my deck is from that re-release in 1971. In 2009, US Game Systems published a commemorative deck to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of this deck's existence, and they continue to be the official distributor of this deck. So that is one of the very popular decks used. The other deck that I will be spending a lot more time talking about throughout the series is the Light Seers Tarot deck. This deck was created by Chris Ann in 2019 and was a deck she created to try and generally bring a happier meaning to the different cards, and she also wanted to create more meaningful connections to each of the different characters and symbols throughout the deck. To do this, she created a spread with a lot more relatable and diverse characters that are much easier to connect to and feel a bit more modernized from the imagery you see in the Rider-Waite deck and other decks. Not that those are not still amazing decks to practice with, but it just offers a different form of connection for someone practicing. This is a slightly biased opinion, but the imagery in the cards is absolutely gorgeous, and it really is a great beginner deck because the imagery is so detailed and more modernized. So as you draw each card, it really does evoke different feelings in you. You intuitively know what the cards mean as you're pulling them. So I love it. It is what I practice regularly with. The deck focuses on playing with lit versus dark paths. Every card emphasizes the light and shadow seer meanings of each card and the lessons you can take away from each of them. With this deck, and with tarot in general, there's not really a bad card. Each card offers different lessons to take away, different things to keep in mind as you continue your journey. The deck comes with a small guidebook, and Chris Ann is actually releasing a more detailed guidebook on October 29th that I'm super excited to get. I will have already recorded several episodes by the time I get mine, so there might be some additional information I get from that book that I will supplement later on, in case I miss it as I start breaking down the first major arcana cards. I will be jumping back to the Light Seers deck in a moment, but before I do, as I was kind of looking at some of the different decks that exist out there, I found some additional general learnings when you're handling your deck. One thing I didn't realize is that as you're doing a reading for someone and as you're handling the decks, holding the cards in your right hand or your left hand actually has different meanings. Your right hand is your giving hand in that it gives energy to the deck. So when you're holding out the deck to someone or when you're charging it, you should be using your right hand. The left hand is your hand of fate. So that is what you should really be using when you're picking your cards or slicing the deck for your reading. Additionally, it's really important to continually charge your deck as you're doing different readings. Using your cards regularly will drain its energy over time, and your readings will not be as impactful or meaningful. There are different ways to charge your deck. One of The first things you can do as you get your deck is to just spend a lot of time touching it, imbuing your own energy into the deck, so shuffling it regularly. One form of charging it is called a rising charge, as I read online. And it's kind of similar to baking a loaf of bread, where you just shuffle your cards throughout the day. Like every hour you take your deck, you shuffle it, you're putting a little more of your energy in it. And by the end of the day, your cards will speak to you much more than they would have at the start. Another general thing you can do to let them charge is just not using them for some time, putting them in a space that is meant for your cards, not just shoving it in a corner, but respectfully placing your cards in a space where they can rest for the night, for a week, whatever time you want to give it. One other way to charge your cards, which is something I've actually done more recently, is a lunar charge. So on a full moon or a new moon, you can put your deck out in the moonlight, and it will take energy from nature and the night at that moment and help recharge your cards a lot more. Your deck doesn't have to be outdoors. It can be indoors too, but just somewhere where it's kind of exposed to that air. Full moons increase magical energy in your deck, and new moons increase the intuition in your deck. So doing both will just help with your readings and increase the impactfulness of them. Some other ways to recharge the energy or renew it is, this one's kind of funny, but just doing a chaotic shuffle where you can take your cards and spread them on the ground or spread them on a table and just really shuffle them around, completely change the order of what they are, but then it'll allow some of the cards that have been tucked away and not used in a really long time to get energy from the cards that are seen more often, or the ones that are at the top of the deck more often. And it'll also just kind of help realign the cards based on what's going on around you in that moment. So that one's a really fun one. I don't do it that often, but I did do it this morning. So it should help reset my deck as I do my next reading today. And then one other idea I saw that I don't know if I'll ever, well, I guess I kind of do it with this podcast now, but is talking to your deck or singing to it. I don't think I would do that one. To feed it your own energy. I initially reading this was thinking I don't ever talk to my deck, but upon reflection, I have been talking to my deck, because as I'm doing these readings, I am just talking to space. So I'm basically talking to my deck and telling it all of my deepest, darkest secrets as I do a reading for myself every time. So yeah, that's fun. It's kind of funny to think about. I'm going to take a short break, and when I'm back, I am going to be breaking down my Light Seers deck a lot more and share some of the first steps I took when I actually received it. I'll be right back. So opening up my deck, there's a little guidebook that came with the cards. One of the first things you need to do when you get your deck is to really get to know your cards and see how they speak to you. There are some recommendations about sleeping with your cards by your pillow or even under your pillow so that you're really connecting your energy to the cards. I actually did do this the first couple weeks I got my deck, but have not done it since. I don't know if I'll do it again, but it is supposed to be a really quick way for you to really expel your energy into the cards in your calmest state, and also while your subconscious is at the forefront, because when you're sleeping, your thoughts are really processing the day and letting your subconscious take over through dreams. So it is a really interesting concept. If anyone listening has done that or has other thoughts about how they first connected with their deck, let me know. I'm really curious. I do continue to shuffle the cards and hold them really regularly, and I try to make sure that I'm still constantly connected to my deck. The other major first step that is recommended specifically for the Light Seers tarot deck, and I'm sure anyone can do this for any of their decks as well, but a step recommended in the guidebook was to lay out all of your cards in front of you, really take a look at the different cards, and go through them and pick out your light and your shadow seer cards. And this is actually better to do when you first receive your deck and don't have a lot of knowledge about the meanings of the cards, because then it's more of an intuitive which card calls to you and which ones don't. So what does that mean? The Light Seer card is the card that brings you the most joy and the one that really calls out to you in the deck. When this gets called in a reading later on, it will help be your champion and guide you towards a brighter future. So as you're looking at your deck, you really want to pick the one that appeals to you the most and the one that really calls to you. The Shadow Seer is the card that you dislike the most. This is the one that you're going to feel a strong aversion for and you really don't want to keep looking at it. It makes you uncomfortable. Something along those lines. When this card is drawn later on, when you're doing readings, it will reflect your strong discomfort and offer some of the biggest lessons learned to help steer you where you need to go. The Shadow Seer card's not meant to be a bad omen when you pull it later on, but rather it serves as a huge guiding light on how to overcome what you're facing in that moment. I've talked about how the major arcana are major milestones in your life and represent pivotal moments. In that same way, the Light and Shadow Seer cards are pivotal cards for you personally. So when you draw them later on, you kind of treat them with that same regard. As I'm talking about all of this, I have a little treat to share. I don't know if anyone listening really considers it a treat, but I thought it was a treat for myself as I was going through and trying to find some of my old notes and research I had done on tarot when I first started this. And I actually found my old journal. I found an old journal entry from the first time I ever opened this deck and picked my Light and Shadow Seer cards, which is so funny. And I wrote about it that day. And it turns out I got this deck a little further back than I originally thought when I recorded my first episode. I think I said it was about a year, which, oops, it's actually been almost 3 years because I wrote this entry on January 22nd in 2022. Crazy, right? I'm a little shocked by that. I was not expecting that. I'm gonna just kind of read my little snippet of what I wrote in here because I think it's kind of funny. But yeah, January 22nd, it was a Saturday. My one thing that day was brunch and beaches, and the weather was sunny. Today was so much fun. I took my first step towards my tarot journey, and I hung out with a couple friends. We went to Yoke Cafe in Manhattan and hung out at Bruce's Beach. It was so much fun and super relaxing. I took a nice relaxing bath after, dealt with some work stuff, and picked my Light Seer and Shadow Seer cards. I'm so excited to really begin my tarot journey more regularly. My Light Seer card is the Fool, and my Shadow Seer card is the Three of Swords. My lyric of the day: you've been stressed out lately, yeah, me too. It's funny reading this because I am one of the most inconsistent journalers ever. I, once a year, will have this bout of inspiration to start journaling again, so I'll have 2 weeks worth of journal entries, and then I'll stop, and I just won't journal for another year until that next bout of inspiration hits me. So I consider myself very lucky that I happened to be in one of those bouts of inspiration when I first opened my Light Seers deck and picked my cards. Just because it's funny to read that and see that I had it documented. I will note, as I went through the process of picking my cards, there were several that appealed to me on the light side and the shadow side, but ultimately, the Fool was the one that appealed to me the most, and the Three of Swords was the one that really... I don't even know what the word is. I really didn't like it at the time. Before I jump into the meanings of the cards, I did do this exercise all over again now, almost 3 years later, where I laid out all my cards and I was looking through them and seeing which one would I pick as my Light and my Shadow Seer card today. And there were still a couple other cards that were kind of a close call. On the Light Seer side, I was debating between the Fool and the Sun, but ultimately decided the Fool still kind of held the most special place in my heart. And then on the Shadow Seer side, I was debating between the Three of Swords and the Eight of Swords. And the Three of Swords just really hit a nerve in me. So that one is still definitely my Shadow Seer card. So it's funny that these cards I picked 3 years ago without knowing the meaning of any of them still very much hold true and still hold that special place in my heart now. So enough about that. Let me actually talk about the cards. As I mentioned, my Light Seer card is the Fool. My first impression of this card was that she looks so carefree and happy as she's suspended over this cliff. And the colors and general art on the card are so beautiful, but just something about how her eyes are closed and she's just kind of leaning into this open space really stuck with me. Learning more about the meaning of the Fool and how it represents the beginning of journeys and being open-minded felt like a great omen for me. Back when I drew this card, I was figuring out how to build better friendships in LA since I hadn't been living here long, figuring out how to really acclimate to work more, starting to learn tarot, or at least attempting to, since we know where that went, and generally rebuilding myself after a rough time in college. It was a really transitional period for me, and now, almost 3 years later, I am once again in a pretty transitional period where I started a new role at work recently. I'm starting this podcast and actually diving into tarot this time around, and just generally readjusting my personal life and what I do with my time to maintain a healthy work-life balance and a generally healthy mental state. I will be breaking down the Fool a lot more in my next episode, so I'm going to save a lot of the different cards' meanings for then, but it's really beautiful to me how much a single card can really speak to you. My Shadow Seer card is the Three of Swords. My first impression of this card, as I was really looking at it, was of someone in immense pain. She is tied by strings coming out of a wounded heart that is somewhat stitched together, but it's really just a broken heart. And for some reason, as I was looking at this card, I really felt her pain deep in my soul. And the way she's screaming out, and I don't know like what she's screaming to, but really it just looks like she's screaming out to the void. It really called out to how I feel I internally scream out for help when I'm really hurting and I don't know how to heal. I mentioned that when I first got this deck in January 2022, I was trying to re-figure out my life. And part of that was healing from some relationships that had ended poorly in the prior years, including a couple toxic ones that really left some scars on my heart. I don't want to get too heavy into the details here and really expose myself to the whole world, but all to say, the pain that I saw in the card really resonated with a lot of the pain I had felt in those prior years and a lot of what I was still healing from in that moment. Even now, going through the cards again, this is still the one that brings me the most discomfort because I think that pain still resonates. Looking at the meaning of this card, it represents exactly what I was talking about, painful separation. It reflects on what happens and how we feel when we lose something that we thought we'd always have in our life, resulting in one of the most painful heartaches we've ever experienced. It comes with a lesson and reminder that this pain will pass and we should continue to move forward with a tender heart, slowly healing with each step we take. Even now, going through the cards again, this one still brings me the most discomfort and still seems to hit a nerve inside of me. My therapist might say it has to do with those old wounds that left scars and never really fully healed. I'd say that's probably true. Yeah. The meaning behind this card still houses a lot of my biggest fears and discomforts, and definitely serves as a lesson I keep in mind as I continue on my journey, and something I think about often with the relationships around me. It's funny talking about the Light and Shadow Seer cards in a lot more detail and talking about what I had picked and what they meant at that time, and also what they mean when you do readings with them, because I have had readings where I've drawn the Fool over time, but last week I actually did a reading that I was originally going to tag to a different episode, but am tagging to this episode instead because, spoiler alert, I drew my Shadow Seer card, which I think is a first for me. I've never actually had it in a reading, and I cheated a little bit in that I kind of reflected on the meaning of my spread after reviewing these notes and looking back at what it means when it comes up in a reading. So stay tuned. I will be taking a short break, and then I will be sharing that tarot spread I did and breaking down the meaning of each of the cards with a little more insight to what they mean. I'm back, and I am ready to do a tarot reading for myself as I start a new week. For this reading, I've decided I want to focus more on some of the friendships and relationships in my life. I don't know why really, but it's been a big topic on my mind. It's something I really treasure, a lot of the friendships and relationships around me, and obviously in life, things are always changing and moving around, so it's something that I thought would be interesting to do a reading for. So without trying to predict too much of what I might get in a reading, I'm going to start shuffling my cards, and I'm going to really think about friendship and my friends around me. What has that look like? What will that look like? Okay, some cards went flying, but now we're back, and I am going to keep shuffling these. But of course, they all went flying like that on me. Okay. I'm going to pull the pamphlet to the side, and I'm just going to split my deck 3 ways for myself. So this is my first split. Second split, and my third split. Okay, I have split my deck, so now I'm going to flip over each of the cards. The first one upside down is Justice. The second one upside down is 3 of Swords. And the third one upside down as well is the Hierophant. When I drew these cards, there was kind of a general order for them, but as I'm kind of reading them and interpreting them, I think it is more of a general 3-card spread. I can still keep to some of the themes of the first one is what I want, what I'm hoping to achieve. The second one is an obstacle standing in my way, and the third one is my path to achieve my goals. But it is also kind of just a great general spread. Before really jumping into the meanings of the cards, it's worth noting, and I mentioned this in the episode earlier because I did rearrange the order of the readings I did and which episodes I'm tagging them to, because my Shadow Seer card got pulled for this reading, and it is the first time I think I've ever done a reading for myself and pulled this card. So feels big, and I don't know, maybe also kind of sucks at the same time. This is a pretty stacked spread because there's 2 major arcana and then my Shadow Seer. And
that on its own is pretty representative of major shifts going on in my life, something big happening, or really just keeping in mind these huge lessons as I'm steering these next steps in my life. So, diving into the meaning of the cards, justice is about balance, it's about karma, cause and effect. For all good, there is good karma. For all bad, there is bad karma. This, along with every other card, was pulled in the reverse position. So as I read the Shadow Seer meaning, it kind of touches more on imbalance that might exist in my life right now. Things don't seem to be quite as harmonious or balanced as I want them to be. Part of that might be that I need to take responsibility for some of my actions, better understand the role I play in how things are right now. And if fear is causing me to act in a way I'm not proud of, I need to seek perspectives and judgment from others to understand how to kind of balance those cards out and balance out how I act moving forward. Basically, how to tip the scales to be balanced again. That one kind of hits a little bit because as I'm thinking about issues I might be having with some people around me or some of like my insecurities and concerns, there are definitely parts that I play in it that I need to take accountability for, but it's always a little hard accepting that and admitting that. But I will say the lesson that I love every time I read the guidebook for justice is that the path in front of me isn't black and white, but it is always one of love. And to just keep that in mind as I'm navigating these situations. The second card I drew is the Three of Swords, which, as I've said, is my Shadow Seer card and is the card that brings me the most discomfort out of everything in this deck. Mostly because it really hits home with its imagery and its meaning. This is a card about painful separation and heartbreak. In the reverse position, the Shadow Seer meaning is, or tells me that I might not be accepting that pain and the need to heal. I'm kind of stuck in the past and stuck in that sadness instead of trying to move forward. And the lesson to really keep in mind with this card is, despite that pain and despite what has happened, you need to keep moving forward with an open and tender heart. And I think kind of combining that lesson with justice, there are definitely actions I take or ways I know I close myself off because of past painful situations that I don't want to repeat. But this card is a reminder to remain open and continue to be vulnerable with people I care about around me. So that's pretty interesting. And then the last card is the Hierophant, which is about learnings and teachings, bettering your understanding around you, maybe taking more time to travel a path of spirituality. With this card, I think my focus is a little less on the spirituality side, especially because that's not as much of a focal point in what I'm asking in this reading. But I do think the general lessons of taking time to seek guidance, taking time to reflect on your beliefs and your beliefs and what grounds you does very much apply, in that it's probably a good time to reevaluate what I expect from others around me versus what it is I'm really looking for and what are the things that matter the most to me, and just kind of resetting my way of thinking around that. At least that's how I will interpret these cards. At some point, I have no idea when this would actually happen. I think it'll be really cool to see how other people might interpret the same cards that I pull for myself. I used to do this with one of my friends where we would do a video chat every now and then, and do tarot readings for ourselves and each other, where we'd each pull our own cards and do a spread for ourselves, interpret it for ourselves, but then we'd also read those same cards for the other person. And it is really funny and really cool how in tarot so much of it is about interpretation. It's about who is reading the cards, because everyone sees it differently. Everyone sees the spread differently. And it does make a difference when someone else who is not as involved in your day-to-day is sharing general lessons and themes, because it won't be biased or won't be swayed by what you want to hear and what you're thinking of in that moment. So at some point, that would be a really cool thing to do. I have no plans for that right now, and I'm not quite sure how I would set that up, but maybe one time I'll be able to reconnect with said friend who I used to do this with, and we'll record it for the podcast. We'll see. Anyways, that is my spread that honestly very much answered the question I was asking, just not quite in the way I was expecting, but I guess that is what the cards are here for, is to help shed light and make us think about things that we wouldn't otherwise.
Thank you for listening to Tea and Tarot with Yashna. This episode was produced, hosted, and edited by me, Yashna Bunsel, and brought to you by Tea Time Podcast. The tarot reading was done using the Light Seers deck by Chris Ann, and all card visuals were from the Light Seers deck and the Rider-Waite tarot deck. Music was made using SoundRaw. Research was done using Wikipedia, The Ultimate Guide to Tarot by Liz Dean, the Light Seers Guidebook, and lots of Google searches. Join me next week for another episode of Tea and Tarot.